Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. You can get any updates to the forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. You can also call the weather info line, 1-885-937-4977. Get any updates to the forecast through that means as well. Starting off, we want to take a look at how wet it has been in the Anchorage area. So far, we are at the 5th highest monthly total for July, up to 4 inches. And that is only of July 23rd. So as we expect more rain on the way, it'll be interesting to see how far up the charts we can climb in the Anchorage area. For some of our advisories that we have out for the state, we'll start off with high surf advisory down in southwest Alaska. This is going to be from Kipnik to Togiak and Twin Hills area. It's going to be this evening at 10 p.m., lasting through 4 p.m. Monday, and the high surf with the highest impacts is expected to be around 4 a.m. and later. We could see storm surge 1 to 2 feet above high astronomical tide and up to 3 feet for some areas near Togiak. And they do expect these high surf conditions to travel up the west coast as we move later in time into Monday and Tuesday. So around the Yukon Delta area, we do have a high surf advisory in effect from 4 p.m. Monday until 7 p.m. on Tuesday, with 3 to 4 feet above normal high tide expected. And then as we get to the eastern portions of Norton Sound, this one's going to be a little bit later, starting at 10 p.m. Monday evening and going until noon on Wednesday, with 4 to 6 feet above normal high tide expected. These conditions will continue up the coast. Right now we're just looking at some elevated surf through the Kotzebue Sound area for the remainder of the coastline around the Seward Peninsula and St. Lawrence Island up into Kotzebue Sound. We also have out east by the Alaska Range several wind advisories in effect. For the eastern and western portions of the Alaska Range, these are going to be in effect from midnight tonight until 10 p.m. on Monday, with gusts up to as high as 65 miles per hour. And then in the Delta Junction area, we also have wind advisory in effect. That's going to start at 6 a.m. on Monday and then go until 10 p.m. on Monday, with gusts as high as 50 miles per hour expected. For our fire weather, we are looking at some warm and dry conditions in the eastern interior that are going to raise fire danger to moderate to high for tomorrow. A lot of areas that have seen a lot more rain are going to have deeper fuels that are damp enough to control the measures in areas as we start to see some of those new fires. And then for wet and windy weather coming into western and southern Alaska, this will keep fire danger low for the start of the week. As we look out ahead in time, we do expect cooler but drier conditions late in the week that should keep fire danger in the low to moderate range for most areas. So as you can see on our map for our spruce adjective, we do have low fire danger for much of mainland Alaska. But as we looked at on the previous slide, we do have high and very high conditions for the central and eastern portions of the interior and up into the Yukon Flats area. For our satellite imagery, we have one main system that's moving through the Bering Sea. We're starting to see the cloud cover extend out over southwest Alaska. As we watch this loop again, we can see that low tracking more towards the north and east as it moves away from the eastern Aleutian Islands. And we can see more cloud cover and precipitation being pulled in from the North Pacific with this towards Kodiak Island and into the Gulf of Alaska. Out over mainland Alaska, eastern portions of the state are actually seeing some clearing from the cloud cover, but as we get up into the Brooks Range and especially areas out west, we are seeing quite a bit of cloud cover at this time. So as we look at our weather for the remainder of the day, we do have that low pressure system by the eastern Aleutians continuing its track to the northeast towards southwest Alaska, and this is going to eventually be the producer of those high surf advisories along the west coast. But for now, it is by the eastern Aleutian Islands, bringing rain throughout the central and eastern Aleutians, as well as much of the eastern Bering Sea and into southwest Alaska, including Kodiak Island. And that precip is going to continue up the west coast of the state and into the Brooks Range. Up along the Arctic coastline, we'll see some areas of fog. And then in the central and eastern interior, a lot of drier conditions expected. Our frontal system from the main low will be pushing out through the Gulf of Alaska, bringing low to the North Gulf Coast and into the Panhandle. And then way out west, we are seeing high pressure build in out over the western Aleutians. For tonight, that high is going to extend out over the central Aleutians, keeping fair weather for the central and western Aleutians. And our low will have moved up towards the southwest Alaska coastline, starting to bring those westerly winds into Bristol Bay. We will see rain from this system out through much of the eastern Bering Sea, all of the west coast, into south central Alaska, and down the coastline into the Panhandle. Some areas of fog are also going to be expected around Norton Sound and into the western portions of the interior. Up along the Arctic coastline, we'll start to see a little bit of drier conditions for tonight. As we move into Monday, that low that was over southwest Alaska will have pushed up by the Seward Peninsula, and you can see those westerly winds coming in all along the west coast, bringing in those high surf advisory conditions. We're also going to see a lot of rain with that low, and areas mixed with fog as we go by the Norton Sound and into much of the interior towards the Brooks Range. Up along the Arctic coastline, western areas, you're going to see some rain. As we drop down to the southern portions of the state, continued rain from southwest Alaska through south central, down the coastline into the central and northern portions of the Panhandle. Out west, our high pressure will have moved even farther to the east, moving over the eastern Aleutian Islands, bringing some drier conditions to all of the Aleutians and up by the Pribilof Islands. As we move into Tuesday, a new system will approach the central and western Aleutians from the North Pacific, bringing more rain back to the areas, and our high pressure will have pushed off farther to the east towards Bristol Bay, starting to clear out some of the areas around the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island. Mainland Alaska, however, will be primarily in rain from low pressure that's up to the north. That rain is going to be all along the Arctic coastline, but starting to get cold enough to mix with snow along some areas along the Arctic. In the interior, we're going to see some rain and fog extending out west towards the Seward Peninsula area and Norton Sound, and then some rain for our areas farther south into the Alaska Range, as well as southwest Alaska. Then down in the Gulf of Alaska, we'll see some rain by Yakutat extending down into the northern portions of the Panhandle. So look at our lows for Monday morning. Starting off in the Panhandle, we're going to see temperatures down in the lower to mid 50s, and that's going to be true for south central as well, dropping down to near 50 for Valdez and Glen Allen. High temperatures Monday afternoon getting up around 60 degrees for northern locations of the Panhandle, and in the mid to upper 60s for places in the south. For south central, getting up to around 60 degrees most locations, a little bit warmer in Glen Allen. And then Tuesday morning dropping down into the mid 50s for the Panhandle and near 50 degrees for south central Alaska and Kodiak Island. Tuesday afternoon getting back up into the lower 60s for northern locations of the Panhandle, and then into the 70s for areas down into the south. For the south central locations, getting up right around 60 degrees to those lower 60s. Then up in the interior, going to drop down into the mid 50s to lower 50s for Monday morning along the Arctic coastline, into the 30s, and in the 40s along the west coast. Monday afternoon highs getting up into the 70s for central and eastern locations of the Panhandle, 60s out east, and then up into the 40s for the Arctic coastline, and into the 50s down the west coast. Tuesday morning lows dropping to the upper 40s to near 50 degrees in the interior, dropping to the mid to upper 30s for the Arctic coastline to near 40 for some of the locations out east. Down the west coast dropping down into the 40s. Tuesday afternoon highs getting up to around 60 for the eastern locations and in the 50s for the western locations of the interior. Up into the 40s to 50s for the Arctic coastline and in the 40s for much of the west coast. Monday morning lows in the southwestern portion of the state around 50 degrees and in the 40s for the Aleutians. Monday afternoon highs getting up into the mid to lower 50s for the southwestern areas and a near 50 for the Aleutians. Tuesday morning lows dropping down into the mid 40s for southwest Alaska, mid 40s for the Aleutians as well. And finally on Tuesday afternoon, getting up into the mid to upper 50s for southwest Alaska and down to near 50 degrees for the Aleutian Islands, with 52 expected for St. Paul.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start with a look at our flying weather on Monday morning. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutians out west, we're seeing a lot of clearing and VFR conditions, but out east, we're going to start to see more MVFR and IFR conditions making it into the west coast of Alaska as well as the Bering Sea and eastern Aleutians. Some of that IFR and MVFR conditions is going to push up the west coast, and then along the Arctic coastline we'll see primarily MVFR right along the coast with some IFR out over the water. Interior Alaska will be primarily VFR, but we will see some MVFR through south central and IFR conditions along the North Gulf Coast and Kodiak Island. That IFR is going to extend out over the Gulf of Alaska and through the Panhandle. Then Monday afternoon, going to start to see some clearing in the southern portions of the Panhandle, dropping down to MVFR, but IFR conditions up north through much of the Gulf of Alaska and North Gulf Coast. However, Kodiak Island will start to clear out and be VFR Monday afternoon, and MVFR conditions primarily through south central Alaska and southwest. However, YK Delta area is going to start to see some IFR conditions, and those IFR conditions are going to extend up much of the west coast, western portions of the Seward Peninsula, and up to the northwest coastline. Out over the western mainland, we're going to see some MVFR conditions, but in the interior should still be primarily VFR, then MVFR and IFR along the Arctic coastline. Down in the Bering Sea and Aleutians, we're going to see quite a bit of IFR in northern and western locations, but central and eastern Aleutians are going to be VFR on Monday afternoon. Tuesday morning, going to start to see that IFR spread towards the central Aleutians as well as the western Aleutians and northern Bering, and IFR conditions pushing into much of the western portion of mainland Alaska, including all the west coast and starting to get into the western interior as well. Up into the Brooks Range, we're going to see quite a bit of IFR and then some IFR along the Arctic coastline. Eastern portions of the interior holding on to VFR conditions, but a mixture of MVFR and IFR as we move down to south central Alaska. The Panhandle will be primarily MVFR, but there will still be some IFR out over much of the Gulf of Alaska and extending north into the Yakutat area. Tuesday afternoon, clearing up quite a bit for the Gulf, just some lingering MVFR conditions for the most part, but in the Panhandle, northern portions are going to see IFR and then MVFR and VFR farther to the south. South central Alaska will be primarily VFR as well as much of the interior. Until we get out west along much of the western mainland, we're going to see MVFR with IFR as we get closer towards the water. Up along the Arctic coastline, going to see primarily MVFR right along the water with some IFR conditions out over the Arctic. Down in the Bering Sea and Aleutian, a widespread IFR is expected with the exception of the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula, where we'll see some VFR conditions holding on. Taking a look at our passes, starting up north, Anaktuvuk Pass will be VFR throughout the day Monday. Adigan Pass is also expected to be VFR. Lake Clark should start off IFR and then improve to marginal conditions in the afternoon, but Merrill will be MVFR throughout the day. Rainy Pass should also be MVFR throughout the day Monday, as well as at Windy. Isabel will start off VFR but then drop down to marginal conditions in the afternoon, and Mentasta will stay VFR throughout the day. Tenedo Pass will be down to MVFR all day on Monday, and Portage will start off MVFR, then drop down all the way to IFR in the afternoon. Chilkoot and White should both be IFR throughout the day Monday. For our freezing levels, we can see a trough of colder air extending out over much of the Bering Sea with freezing levels down to as low as 4,000 feet for the Bering. And then that's going to pick up to be a lot warmer and higher freezing levels as we move closer towards the Gulf of Alaska, with freezing levels getting up to 14,000 feet over the Panhandle. For our icing along much of the west coast and extending down into the Bering as well, starting with the southern locations out in the southeastern Bering between 4,000 and 7,000 feet expected, above 5,000 feet for YK Delta and Northern Sound area, and then above 6,000 feet as we get up to the northwest coastline. For our jet stream, strongest portion of the jet is going to be out over the Alaska Peninsula out of a west to southwest direction up to as high as 120 knots, and moving out over central portions of the mainland 105 to 110 knots out of a southwest direction. Dropping down to 9,000 feet, strongest winds are going to be right through the central portion of the mainland, up to as high as 70 knots near the Alaska Range out of a south to southwest direction, dropping down to 55 knots as we move closer towards the Brooks Range, western Brooks Range. Out over south central Alaska, still seeing winds in the 50s, and then 55 knots out over the Gulf of Alaska out of that southwesterly direction as well. Dropping down over the Panhandle, 30 to 35 knots out of a westerly direction, and then out over the eastern portions of the Gulf and southwest Alaska, around 40 knots there out of the west. For 3,000 feet, strongest winds now are going to be just south of the low by the Seward Peninsula out of a northwesterly direction, 45 knots, and then also up along the western portions of the Arctic coast out of a east to southeast direction up to as high as 45 knots there as well. Western mainland is going to see 40 knot winds out of the south. For turbulence all along the west coast down into the Alaska Peninsula, below 4,000 and 5,000 feet there, and below 6,000 feet for south central Alaska.
Technology. It's the rhythm of our everyday life. We're more dependent on satellite and communication systems than at any other time in history. Disruptions can affect our economy and even our safety. To prepare for the effects of such events and minimize impacts, we need to look outside our atmosphere some 93 million miles away, at a star we call the Sun. It's our main energy source. It warms the Earth and grows our food. While the Sun and the space between may seem pleasant from our perspective, it's anything but peaceful. At its surface exists a chaotic state of eruptions and radiation. And unlike Vegas, what happens at the Sun doesn't stay at the Sun.
Space weather is essentially emissions from the Sun, radiation, magnetic field that erupts from the solar surface, pumped out into space, sometimes right towards Earth. When it impacts the Earth, it impacts our technology. That's what we call space weather.
These solar events and their effects at Earth can disrupt systems we take for granted. From causing blackouts to the power grid, to delaying offshore drilling operations due to inaccurate GPS data. Interference with communication systems can force air traffic to reroute and impact rescue response and coordination. Outside our atmosphere, solar radiation can harm astronauts and the systems they depend on. The good news is that these eruptions can be detected early. Forecasters at the NOAA Space Weather Prediction Center in Boulder, Colorado, have their eyes on the Sun at all times.
The Space Weather Prediction Center is part of the National Weather Service and is very much like a normal weather forecast office. We're here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We're looking at data, we're looking at imagery, we're looking at model outputs. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches of imminent activity to our customers so they can take action.
In many ways, forecasting space weather is a lot like forecasting hurricanes. Those who rely on space weather forecasts, like electric power grid managers, are informed early on and can begin taking protective action.
When we see an eruption on the Sun, space weather forecasters will issue a watch. This is much like a hurricane watch. When a hurricane sits offshore of Miami, for example, perhaps 48 hours out, we too can see way in advance that something may be coming towards the Earth.
As the storm moves toward us, it hits a monitoring spacecraft orbiting 1 million miles away from Earth.
It's kind of our buoy sitting out there offshore, and that hurricane, about 45 minutes before it makes landfall, we'll get the measurements from the buoy. That's what this spacecraft does for us. That big eruption that left the Sun hits the spacecraft. Now we've got the measurements of exactly what's going to impact us here on Earth, and we issue the warnings to give the power grid a heads up that the storm is now imminent. An interesting element to this whole process is that when the forecasters issue the alert, the power grid receives the alert, takes the necessary actions to protect the grid, and the average citizen never knows anything ever happened.
The number of customers who rely on space weather information continues to grow. As our reliance on technology increases, so will our need for constant monitoring of the Sun.
Space weather affects technologies. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches to our customers so they can take action.
GPS has changed society. Most people don't realize how remarkable and how many different applications there are.
The GPS has become an integral part not just of our daily lives as far as cell phones and guidance for our cars and mapping, but the whole system in agriculture is really relying heavily on high accuracy GPS.
So they're using GPS to plant those seeds with centimeter accuracy, and then they can come behind it and irrigate and fertilize right where that seed is with that 1 centimeter accuracy.
The GPS creates a line for the operator that he can steer along, or you go to another level and the operator doesn't steer anymore and the tractor has an automatic steering system on it, much like a cruise control on a car, except for when I push the button it doesn't drive a set speed. When I push a button it stays on a predefined line.
You don't even need lights. You can do it at nighttime. You program your GPS and it's driving that tractor for you. So it's huge, and it's changing the way that the farmers farm the fields.
6 or 7 days out.
There's an interest in GPS applications from space weather side because when the sun is eruptive, it causes GPS to falter, and in some cases it doesn't work at all.
Productivity may suffer to a certain degree in that there's no way that I as a human being can steer as good 8 hours a day as a GPS system's going to do. It's going to be the same all day long. Some of the other application technologies, those are going to be gone. We're not going to have the ability to do good section control on sprayers and planters and fertilizer applicators without GPS.
We see a huge growing customer base in so many different industries, so many different sectors now relying on GPS and high precision GPS. They're all big customers for us.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine section of the forecast. We'll start off with a quick look at our ice edge. Overall, we are still seeing a slow and steady breakup for the Alaska waters. And as we compare this to last year, out over the Chukchi Sea, we are a little bit faster than we were last year. However, over the Beaufort Sea, we are a little bit slower than last year. Taking a look now in southeast Alaska and the inside waters, central and northern areas are seeing south to southeast winds 10 to 20 knots, highest up by Lynn Canal, and then northwest winds in the southern inside waters 15 knots there. Weaker winds out over the eastern Bering west 10 knots, becoming south to southeast as we move farther to the north 15 to 20 knots, getting up to as high as 25 knots in the far northern places of the Gulf. As we move into Tuesday, we are seeing northwest winds 10 to 15 knots in the central and southern inside waters, and then south 15 in Lynn Canal. Out over the Gulf waters, we're seeing primarily westerly winds 10 to 15 knots for the most part, getting stronger as we get farther to the east up to as high as 20 knots. Out over south central Alaska and the Gulf waters, seeing south-southeast winds 25 to 30 knots for the most part, a little bit weaker south of Seward, only 20 knots there. In Prince William Sound, we are seeing southeast winds 30 knots, and then in Cook Inlet, northeast winds 30 knots expected there. However, out by the areas west of the Barren Islands, we're seeing southerly winds at 30 knots. As we move into Tuesday, winds calming down a fair amount. Out over the Gulf waters, we're seeing west winds 15 to 20 knots, picking up to as high as 25 knots by the Barren Islands. Then in Cook Inlet, southwest winds 15 to 20 knots, and Prince William Sound northeast 10 knots expected. Out over the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, starting by Kodiak Island on Monday, southwest winds 25 knots, and that's going to be a fairly true trend for the Pacific side of the peninsula as well. However, much stronger in the Bering waters, southwest winds up to as high as 40 knots, with seas up to as high as 12 feet, and gusts up to 50 knots are expected in Bristol Bay. Then on Tuesday, winds dropping down quite a bit, 10 to 15 knots, out over all of the areas around the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, becoming somewhat more north to northeast on the Pacific side and westerly on the Bering side. Out over the Aleutian Islands on Monday, westerly winds for the eastern Aleutian Islands 20 to 25 knots, westerly winds 15 to 20 knots for the central Aleutians, and then south to west winds 15 knots for the western Aleutian Islands. On Tuesday, becoming much more easterly for all of the Aleutian Islands, 15 knots by the eastern Aleutians, 20 to 25 knots by the central Aleutians, and 25 knots by the western Aleutians. For Monday, along the west coast, primarily a west to northwest wind, 35 to 40 knots around Nunavik Island, 30 knots by St. Lawrence Island, 30 knots by St. Matthew as well, and then 25 knots by the Pribilof Islands. A little bit different in the Norton Sound area, south winds 25 knots as that low moves through. On Tuesday, we're going to see switch to being primarily west to southwest winds at 35 knots in Norton Sound, 30 knots by St. Lawrence Island, 20 to 25 knots around Nunavik Island and St. Matthew Island, and then 15 knots out of the south by the Pribilof Islands. Up along the Arctic coastline for Monday, we are going to see easterly winds 25 knots, and then as we move down the west coast, becoming more northerly around 30 knots. On Tuesday, we're going to see more variable winds along the Arctic coastline, 20 to 25 knots as low pressure moves through the area, with shifting those wind directions around. Then down the west coast, northwest coastline, we're going to see northeasterly winds, 25 to 30 knots, with seas up to 10 feet. And then in the Kotzebue Sound area, southerly winds 25 knots, seas 9 feet. And south of the Bering Strait, westerly winds at 30 knots expected. Quick recap for our weather, starting with tonight. We have a low that was near the eastern Aleutians that is tracked by southwest Alaska and is going to continue its track farther to the north. As this low moves up the coastline, it will bring high surf conditions from the Bristol Bay area through the Norton Sound area, with elevated surf all the way through the Kotzebue Sound area. We do have several high surf advisories out from the Bristol Bay area through the eastern portions of the Norton Sound for now, and we are going to see those starting off later tonight for the southern locations and lasting all the way into Wednesday for some of the more northerly locations as that low tracks to the north. For or elsewhere, we are going to see lots of rain in the Bering Sea, especially central and eastern locations, and that's going to extend into the Alaska Peninsula as well as all of the west coast into the western mainland and all of south central Alaska down the North Gulf coastline into the Panhandle. Though high pressure building in over the Aleutians will keep the central and western Aleutians fairly dry, and that's going to push east as we move into Monday, drying out the eastern Aleutians as well. But our low pressure system now that was over southwest Alaska will push by the Seward Peninsula, bringing continued rain for much of the mainland down into the Gulf and into the Panhandle as well, continuing to see the winds coming in off the west for that higher surf along the west coast.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.